Friends, I have an extremely interesting story about Russian Telegram channels and the Telegram channel's approach to Kirienko, who is President Putin's administration and in fact Putin's right-hand man. So now it has surfaced again. Alla Pugacheva. So what is being attributed to her and what insiders are reporting is that supposedly in the last few weeks, Alla Borisovna has been actively communicating with her close associates in the Russian Federation. These are friends, essentially her creative circle, some propagandists, and also Sergei Kirienko himself. Let me just remind you visually what he looks like. Sergei Kirienko is Putin's right-hand man, the person who currently heads the Department for Relations with CIS countries, oversees the entire CIS space, and is also specifically in charge of the track concerning new territorial acquisitions. He is someone who visits the so-called LDNR at least once every 2 weeks, a person who essentially oversees Pushilin, despite the massive water crisis in Donbass, a man-made disaster directly linked to the actions of the Russian army. But that's not the point. The point is that Ukraine never has losing projects. That's exactly why Pushilin remains there. That's a slightly different story. Now let me get back to Alla Pugacheva. Alla Pugacheva mentioned Kirienko in her big interview. Here's a screenshot of it. You know, millions of people watched it. Alla Borisovna broke her long silence and said a lot of things that many people, especially in the post-Soviet space, found important, sensitive, emotional, philosophical, and wise, as only Alla Pugacheva can express them. But there was also an episode there connected with some rather unclear hints. If you take the whole 3.5 hours of the interview, these are the minutes she devoted to her reflections on when the war will end. In particular, to the author of this YouTube channel where she participated in the interview, she said something like, remember the 26th, I can't recall if it was the 27th, I think it was the 27th, she said. Now then, another story. In fact, according to information from the Telegram channel Kremlin Camp Gossip, Alla Borisovna is planning to return to Russia in the summer of 2026. But before that happens, Pugacheva says that Moscow will face a huge danger and that great changes await Russia. And then what kind of changes are we talking about? And danger awaits the Russian Federation, particularly Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so on. She actually doesn't specify. More precisely, the sources cited by these Telegram channels who are close to Kirienko do not specify. But what is specified is that supposedly, after she mentioned Kirienko in her interview, called him Seryozha, and said that he helped her, somehow she and Galkin were able to leave calmly. Galkin was labeled a foreign agent, but she was not. Well, obviously, because she is still very useful for the Russian Federation today, an absolute opinion leader. So after that, Kirienko had no contact with her, and in fact hasn't had any for several years now. Although these propagandist sources claim once again that he did, that they are negotiating about something. Regarding the danger in Moscow, St. Petersburg, as well as any changes in the Russian Federations, everything is being denied, as expected, by Kirienko's own office. And here is a direct quote. We are under constant threat because there is a war in Russia. That's quite an interesting way to put it. And, you know, that's not far from the truth. In fact, all of this is being said now because from the side of the enemy, NATO, if you will, or more specifically Ukraine, there is indeed an increase in long-range capabilities. Perhaps that's exactly what Pugacheva is referring to. Maybe she's even heard something about Barracudas and Tomahawks. The topic of Tomahawks is really coming to the forefront right now. You know, Volodymyr Zelensky boasted about the fact that over the weekend, he had as many as 2 conversations with Donald Trump, and they discussed strengthening our air defense and our resilience, at least that's what Volodymyr Zelensky writes, and also our long-range capabilities. I don't see the word Tomahawks mentioned further, but the reputable publication Axios has already written about Tomahawks. It writes that Trump and Zelensky have spoken twice so far, and they discussed Putin, really talked about the number of Tomahawks and their possible use, as well as the need to talk to Putin and how to end this war. And today the story continues. Actually, yes. Regarding the great danger for Moscow that Pugacheva mentioned, everything here actually fits together very logically. Right now, Mirov, Yermak, and Sverdenko are flying to the United States of America, and what is the main issue? The issue of missiles and Tomahawks, the issue of air defense again. So, in fact, the meeting between Yermak, Umirov, and Sverdenko with the delegation in the United States will be precisely about continuing these two conversations with Donald Trump. Moreover, just now, right at this moment, I'm just doing this review and I've received information that Volodymyr Zelensky, and this is already being reported, it's official information, will meet. There is a planned meeting with Donald Trump this Friday. And friends, the discussion will be about Tomahawks. And again, recalling Alla Borisovna, danger and major changes are looming for the Russian Federation. The Kremlin is actually in shock right now, and not because of some leaks from Pugacheva and what she might have overheard or possibly knows. But the fact is, the Tomahawk missile itself has such capabilities that it could even pose a nuclear threat to the Russian Federation. At first, this was pushed by propaganda, and now it's Dmitry Medvedev and Peskov talking about it. Dmitry Medvedev is also repeating this and even trying to joke about it, as you can see. Today, he created a detailed post with a submarine, implying that Tomahawks are usually launched from submarines, but there is also foreign equipment. And why couldn't this submarine be not in the steppes, but somewhere, perhaps, say, in the Baltic Sea, or maybe somewhere in the northern seas, and launch from there? Why is it in principle possible to talk about all this? Because it's becoming more and more likely. Well, it's not that it's a reality yet. I don't think they're already packing things up or preparing something in the US. That's just my personal opinion. But the fact that the rhetoric from Washington is now open, not hidden, and public, that's absolutely true. If business is making peace with the help of machine guns, then the phrase is incorrect. The delivery of these missiles could end badly for everyone, and above all, for Trump himself. That's what Medvedev writes. It could end badly. That's the rhetoric. The idea is that if a Tomahawk missile can be fitted with a nuclear warhead, then what does that mean? Moscow accordingly reserves the right to also dramatically escalate the situation. Donald Trump himself, clearly understanding this, says that he now needs to have a detailed conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky, because he understands that if they give Tomahawks to Ukraine, it will be a new level of escalation. Trump says this directly. And here's a great conclusion. Sorry to put it this way, but this time it's actually Lukashenko, Putin's lackey, who draws the right conclusion. He doesn't believe that Tomahawks will be sent to Ukraine, but I think he's right here. Why? Because he believes, after all, that peace talks, a negotiating table, and Putin at the negotiating table alongside Zelensky and Donald Trump, this is an exchange for the possibility of transferring the herb to Ukraine.
Listen, today the world we live in is truly multifaceted and complex, presenting us with a variety of perspectives and challenges. For every poison or harmful influence that exists, there is an antidote or remedy available to counteract it. I believe that the President of the United States understands this reality better than anyone, recognizing the importance of finding solutions and maintaining balance in a world that is constantly evolving. And in order not to slide into that rut when it comes to this serious poison, the antidote to the poison, he understands that this shouldn't happen and he thinks it won't come to that. Well,
honestly, bravo. So Lukashenko has now completely figured out what's going on. The stakes are really rising, and Trump is definitely no fool, and Trump really understands how these missiles could be used. And they understand this in the Russian Federation as well. And when Peskov in Russia says, or Putin has also stated, that globally this won't change anything, that it won't change the situation on the battlefield. Well, it won't change things on the battlefield, but in the deep rear, in Russia's own rear, it will. And that's why this is truly a real threat. And so that Ukraine doesn't just have 2 or 3 dozen, or maybe even 100 of these missiles, which can be launched, roughly speaking, even just from a submarine. But in reality, we don't disclose the details and no one actually knows them perfectly, except for Trump and Zelensky. Yes, so that not even this would be present in Ukrainian warehouses. It's basically bargaining and coercion. Bargaining and coercion. And that's why, in this situation, you have to more or less go along with it. What's more, Trump is even announcing a conversation with Putin. He openly stated as well that he wants to talk to Vladimir Putin about the Tomahawks, whether to transfer them to Ukraine or not. And again, let me remind you, in this context, Trump says this is a new step in escalation. I understand that this is a new step in escalation. We need to talk to Putin. I think he's not a fool either. And we'll come to an agreement. It's blatant bargaining. It's blatant bargaining. And now it's the Russian Federation that has to make a choice. The right choice. It has to make it Basically, there is time until Friday, because on Friday, if there are no changes in the position of the Russian Federation by then, on Friday, we might hear at a joint briefing by Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump about the transfer of 1, 2, 10, or 20 Tomahawk missiles or other long-range weapons like Barracuda, and why not? And this woman's intuition, the one Borisivna whom the Kremlin's mouthpiece is referring to today, it might actually work here right now. Danger awaits Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there are huge changes happening in the Russian Federation. Do you want another example of women's intuition? Look what I found.
Because I, for example, knowing the information, believe that the end of this war is not far off. That's
how it is. Would you like to, let's also do a bit of imagining here. Do these two communicate with each other?